Well, hi everybody. This is our second literary theory. It is feminism. Now, one thing I'm hoping that you start to become aware of as we're doing this is that most of our literary theories are very, very much related. So think back to postcolonialism. Postcolonialism is about who is in charge, how is control held, and why is this person or group in charge. And it's very specifically related to issues of ethnicity and skin color. Feminism is very much related to this. You're still asking those three questions: who's in charge, how is control held, and why is this person in charge? You're just looking at it from a different angle. In the case of feminism, you're looking at female versus male, that is, man versus woman. Biologically, a person is born a woman or a person is born a man. That is feminist theory. We'll get to gender theory, which is a lot bigger and more expansive later on, but for now, for the sake of this, we are looking at feminist. So a woman can behave in a masculine manner. For example, from a reductivist 1950s perspective, a woman can put on pants, but she is still a woman. A man can put on a dress, but he is still a man. It's all about that. Again, when we get into the bigger stuff with gender theory, then we're going to start to really muddy it up. But for the sake of this, it is male versus female. We're looking at male imagery and female imagery. It's an exploration on how those symbols are treated. And by symbols and imagery, what I really mean is characteristics, as well as associated symbols that are tied to it. For example, a rose, for a lot of reasons, is typically seen as feminine. Women are also feminine. A rose is therefore feminine. We're also looking at characteristics. Issues of aggression are stereotypically male. Issues of cooperation are stereotypically female. Now, when we're looking at all of this stuff, we're saying how are female symbols put down or oppressed, and how are male symbols championed. Now, there's a word you want to remember. It's called patriarchal, and it comes from the word patriarchy, which literally means father in charge. That's what it means. In what way do male figures control the narrative? And I've said this in class. I know I've said this in class. God, I hope I've said this in class. This is not only useful for us as readers of fiction, but more importantly for the purposes of this class and the fact that most of you aren't English majors, I hope. It's how we work as writers. You as a writer utilizing a feminist perspective are asking, how does a male figure control the narrative of life? So there are some questions asked. The first question, how is the relationship between men and women portrayed? It's a simple one, right? I mean, there's a man, there's a woman. What is their relationship? Is it equal? Is one in charge? Who's in charge? How is that in-chargeness portrayed? We're also looking at what are the relationships between men and women. What do those power relationships look like? How does a man exercise the fact that he is in charge? Or if we're looking at something which is written from a feminist bent to kind of critique the role of women, maybe we'd ask, how does a woman in charge over men, what does that look like? One of the more interesting things to look at is not a very good movie, The Devil Wears Prada. If you've ever seen it, and I recommend you watch it once, it is interesting because it portrays the power relationship of women as really horrifying. Also, how are male and female roles defined? What constitutes masculinity in this work that we're looking at, and what constitutes femininity in this work that we're looking at? And again, I'm saying work and text and things like that, but really a work and text is reality, real life. We can also look at real life and say, how are the roles of men defined? One really interesting thing to me is army, military, high masculinity. And as a result, the United States is kind of a deification of the armed forces. It seems kind of interesting to me from a feminist perspective how the more aggressive you are as a soldier, the more deified you are, the more heroized, lionized you are. The masculinity becomes that ultimate form of power. And lastly, how do different people or characters embody or defy those traits? You, as a writer, part of your job when you use feminist is to identify what those traits are. What trait is considered feminine? What trait is considered masculine? What symbol is feminine? What symbol is masculine? And how do different people or characters embody or defy those ideas? Straightforward so far, right? Not so bad. Pretty easy. Feminist lens, male, female, who's in charge, why are they in charge? Not too bad. So let's start looking at this. Do characters take on traits from opposite genders? Does a woman behave with masculine traits? Does a man behave with feminine traits? How do they do this? And how does this change other people's reactions to them? And what does the work that we're looking at reveal about the operations of patriarchy? By the operations of patriarchy, I mean the exact same thing I meant with post-colonialism. I mean, we're looking at economics, we're looking at politics, we're looking at society, and we're looking at psychology. Economics is the most interesting thing to me when you think about things like, for example, we have a pay gap in the United States, and it's horrifying, right? We all know about this pay gap. Women are paid 3/4 of what men are paid. But we're not aware of the specifics of how it works. The way it works is tied to maternity leave. And of course, I'm simplifying it. There are other factors, but I'm pointing to this as the most interesting thing to me. A woman has to take maternity leave when she has children, because biologically, women have children. Men do not. They don't do that. I hope you knew that. So, as an employer, from an economic perspective, it behooves them in a completely unregulated world to not hire a woman because they may have to go on maternity leave. As a result, the earning power of the woman is less than the man. We're also looking at things like societal norms. Now, I am hopeful that you wonderful, wonderful children are going off to really wonderful, powerful fields in the sciences, social and hard, as well as engineering, that kind of thing. And for those of you who go off into those fields, if you're a woman, it's going to be difficult in one sense. I mean, the work is not going to be any more difficult for you than it would be a man. That's absurd. But what will be difficult is how you are treated, because girls don't do math. Girls don't game. Girls don't do sciences. As a result, in society, you in that field, it's horrifying. Politically, our last election, it seemed interesting that the female candidate was very much insulted for being an aggressive woman. The politics of being a woman in the world is that you must be passive. And then the psychology of patriarchy. There's a lot of this. You see a lot of this in terms of the psychology of patriarchy. As children, we are raised a certain way. We are raised to see certain traits in one way and certain traits in another way, and it becomes ingrained into our psychology, the way we treat ourselves and others. It's subconscious in many cases. And when we get to post-colonialism, it's going to become a much bigger thing. But suffice to say, if you're 5 and you're told girls don't do math, then when you're 20, you're less likely to do math if you're a girl. And when you're 20, you're less likely to take someone seriously who does math if you're a boy. It's an interesting psychological apparatus. And it's the same thing with post-colonialism. We're also looking at what might this work imply about the possibilities of sisterhood as a method of resisting patriarchy, unification of feminine traits to resist patriarchal control. I'm hoping that one speaks for itself. Next, what might the work say about a woman's creativity, her ability to create work? What does the history of the work's reception, and this is very much looking at things like, printed text and things like that. What does the history of the work's reception by the public and by the critics tell us about patriarchy? When I was a kid, a movie came out. It was called My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I very much liked that movie. Now, that movie did very, very well at the box office, but there was a lot of critique of it because it was woman-led. A woman wrote it, a woman directed, a woman starred in it. It was the same woman, and she's amazing. And she did a sequel, which was not good. But that's not her fault. That's more, don't do sequels to good movies. Just stop that. Now, if you go back and you look at those critiques, especially if you start looking online, you start looking at comment boards about the movie, you start to see a lot of really horrifying words. Like the word gynocentric was something I never knew existed until this movie came out, because people talked about it as being quote unquote gynocentric, woman centric, as a negative thing. It tells you a lot. By belittling a work, a fictional work, you are in fact belittling the voice of the woman who created it. The reception by the public tells us a lot about how patriarchy functions. And what role does a work play in terms of woman's literary history as well as literary tradition? I don't know if you know this, but the canon, the Western canon, is very much dead white dude. There aren't a whole lot of women writers, and the women writers tend to succeed because they exist in traditionally masculine fields, masculine areas, or they cover up the fact that they are women. In the 20th century, we had Ursula K. Le Guin and D.J. Fontana. D.J. Fontana wrote for television. Ursula K. Le Guin was a fiction writer. And they both covered up their names. For a much more modern example, Harry Potter. The author of Harry Potter, the woman's name is Joanne Rowling. She called herself J.K. Rowling to cover up the fact that she is a woman. Go much more historically, we have Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. Ooh, I love that book. She exists because she wrote in such an aggressive style. If you've ever read that book, you can see the aggression and the big, heady philosophical underpinnings to it. And it kind of tells you quite a bit about women's literary history, how in order to survive as a woman, you have to cover up the fact that you're a woman. What's the translation to all of this? Because I'm muddying the waters with a lot of this stuff, aren't I? Translation, there are a lot of ways to understand feminism. There is no single one way, just like post-colonialism. There's no single one way to think. If you, as a feminist critic, are operating under feminism, you're asking a lot of questions about yourself, the world around you, as well as characters that might be in a fictional text. And it's all kind of done with one purpose, in order to understand how a text might support or defy a patriarchy. The big thing to remember, always, feminist criticism assumes that we live in a patriarchy. It is a system of government run by male power, founded by male power. Even if, for example, let's pretend in 2020 we have a woman president and the entirety of Congress and the entirety of the Senate is all women. We are still living in a patriarchy. Just because a woman happens to be in charge does not mean we are not living in a patriarchy, because we are looking at systems that were created with male interests at heart. Either intentionally or unintentionally, our world is built around the idea of feminine ideas, and women specifically being secondary to men and masculine ideas. Now, there are a lot of facets to feminism. Basically, as long as you keep that idea of patriarchy in your head, you keep yourself centered. It's concerned with all of the ways in which literature and media may reinforce or undermine economic, political, social, or psychological oppression. My favorite example of this is antacids. You guys know what an antacid is, right? It's a little pill or whatever you take. You chew on some of them and they make heartburn go away. Antacids, oddly enough, are marketed almost exclusively to men. Commercials have men taking antacids. And antacids in research and testing are tested almost exclusively on men, despite the fact that when you look at it between male and female, the rates of heartburn and indigestion are equal. I mean, just as many women need Tums as men. There are biological differences between a man and a woman. They're subtle, but they're there. And as a result, certain chemicals may affect certain people different ways. And gender, or male and female, that's part of those different ways. By not marketing to women and by not testing on women, it suggests a social and psychological oppression. How might aspects of culture be patriarchal? And how might you strive to expose explicit or implicit misogyny in male writing? I want to point this out. Just because you're trying to expose misogyny in male writing, that doesn't mean you're trying to say somebody is a sexist pig. It's not about judgment. It's just about identification and exposition. Now, misogyny can be translated into many areas. I already gave you the antacid idea, but there's also the antidepressant idea. And I think I'd like to tell you a little bit about why the antacid bit is there before we get to the antidepressants. Now, antacids, heartburn. Well, heartburn and indigestion, that's often related to two things. First is stress, and second is that idea of work. You work too hard, you don't have time to eat properly, indigestion is caused. Well, men are more likely to work hard and need this because men are more likely to not have the time to eat properly. Antidepressants, on the other hand, are marketed to women. And in fact, one of the key words for depression that we use, or I should say historically have used, is hysteria, which is a phenomenally sexist word if you really look at the definition of that word. Antidepressants are marketed to women. Antidepressants are tested almost solely on women. However, antidepressants are needed by men and women equally. Both are prescribed to both groups equally, but clinical trials are often exclusively tested on men. It's just very strange that from a capitalist perspective, we leave money on the table, and from a humanist perspective, we are harming half our population in any given circumstance. And we're doing it because of the way we were raised and the way we were told certain groups of people may behave just because they are men, or certain groups of people may behave just because they are women. Neither of these things are accurate. They're just the way we do it because we're idiots. Now, a feminist critic may also look closely at the traditional canon, looking at the exclusion or marginalization of women writers or women characters. There are very few women writers historically. Most of them did not publish when they were alive. For those of you who know your American literature, one of the most famous woman writers of American history is Emily Dickinson. She published pretty much nothing in her lifetime. It was published after her death. That says a lot. She was rejected a lot, but she was never published in her lifetime. And even today, unless the woman is marketed as a feminist writer, there's a big tendency to underrepresent the contributions of a female writer. There are very few female-led works that exist. And often they exist because they ride on the coattails of other things. Hunger Games, for example, young adults, apocalyptic fiction. Wonder Woman, superhero science fiction. That's how they exist. They don't exist because they are women and unique stories. They exist because they managed to ride the coattails of something else. Now, there are some traits to feminism, and this is going to get a little dry if you're not paying attention. So pay attention. Are you ready? The lens is broad. There's a large variety of uses, but these are the basic ideas that are in common. First, women and feminine traits, interests, and ideals are oppressed by a patriarchy, economically, politically, socially, and psychologically. Patriarchal ideology is the primary means by which they are kept so. Now, that doesn't mean, just like post-colonialism, it doesn't mean physical force. That means getting in your head and tricking you. Little girl being told girls aren't quite as good as boys, either explicitly or implicitly, creates a part of that patriarchy. In every domain where patriarchy is the norm, women is the other. There's always the norm and then woman. For example, doctors, and a woman doctor too. You get what I say. Oftentimes, women are only defined by the differences from male norms and values, rather than as a norm in and of themselves. All of Western civilization is rooted in this patriarchal ideology, going all the way back to the biblical portrayal of Eve as the origin of sin and death. Biology determines sex. We all kind of know that, right? You're born one way, you're born another way, that kind of thing. But culture determines gender values and identities, what is masculine and what is feminine. That is kind of what we're getting at here. All feminist activity, as a critic, has its ultimate goal to change the world by prompting gender equality. And this is the thing that a lot of people miss with feminism. Feminism is not about saying women are better than men. Feminism is about saying women are the same as men. Gender issues also play a part in every aspect of human production and the experience. What we read, what we write, what we produce, what we experience. Whether we're aware of it or not, the way we are raised and how we are taught a man and a woman should be is a big part of what we are. There are some caveats to this, always. First, we're not gender bashing. We're not saying men are pigs. boys, we are not saying you are pigs. This is not what this is about. Just because you are a boy does not mean you are the enemy. So don't go thinking that that's what this means. Please. It's multifaceted. It's about identifying the world that we live in. And this history is coming from three waves of feminism. And I'm going to very quickly go over these because I want us to understand them. The first wave of feminism is from the late 1700s to the early 1900s. Mary Wollstonecraft, mother of Mary Shelley, wrote about the inequalities of rights between the sexes. And more recently, Susan B. Anthony and Victoria Woodhull contributed to women's suffrage, the right to vote. The second wave of feminism is 1960s and 70s, kind of curtailed into the Civil Rights Acts, and was building upon more equal working conditions during World War II. 1966, the group NOW was formed, and it cohered feminist political activism. This was the groundwork for feminist theories, and it dovetailed again into the American Civil Rights Movement. And this is also where feminism as a literary theory comes from. The third wave of feminism is where we're at. And it's about resisting the idea of, again, one being more than the other, one being better than the other. And it's also about resisting that idea of a white, heterosexual, middle-class focus. Because that was very much the previous ones. Second wave feminism was all about the proverbial bra burning, which never happened, by the way. Modern feminism is a much more holistic idea. Just because you're not white, heterosexual, or middle class does not mean you are not part of the experience. Third wave feminism works to expand marginalized populations' experiences. And in fact, if you want to get clever, just a little clever, you can even combine something like post-colonialism into feminism. And many literary theorists argue that post-colonialism and feminism are tied together in the sense that issues of sexuality are used as a method of control. This is not a new concept, but for many years, there's been this idea that the United States has a hierarchy. There's white men, then white women, then black men, then black women. That's the hierarchy. Each group has less power than the previous. And third wave feminism seeks to kind of get rid of all those boundaries. It's about a promotion of dialogue, community, and the valorization of the work that women perform that they've been ignored for in the past, as well as their cultural contributions.